Let's take a look at using some of these lifecycle methods by creating an application that has a second counter, a counter that will count up every second. To start, let's go ahead and create a new component. We'll call this second counter. Inside of our second counter, let's go ahead and import React. Make sure this is a JavaScript file. And import React. Then let's create a class. Export default class, second counter, extends React.component. And we'll add a constructor here. And in our constructor, we're going to pass the props in. Pass those up to this super constructor. And we're going to go ahead and log out each lifecycle method. So we're going to go ahead and run a console.log, and this is our constructor. In this constructor, let's go ahead and set this.state equal to our state object, and this is going to contain it's going to be the current count, which we can either start at 0 or maybe props we can pass in a starting point. So props.start or 0. So if there's nothing in props.start, then it will start by default at 0. Let's go into our render method. And in our render method, let's go ahead first off and log our render so we can see this as we watch it in the console, which lifecycle methods are being called. And we're going to go ahead and return a paragraph with this.state.current count. So we're going to watch that count there. Now let's go ahead and outside of our render, let's add a component did mount method. Component did mount. And in this, we're going to go ahead and again log out our name of our method. So component did mount. There we go. And what we're going to do in the component did mount, we're going to set an interval that's going to start incrementing our state's current count every second. So we'll say set interval. This takes a function. And in this function, we'll go ahead and say this.setState, which also takes a function taking the current state. And we're going to go ahead and say current count is equal to state.currentCount plus 1. So we can increment that. And we're going to do this every 1 second. Let's go ahead and add another method here. We're going to say should component update. And this one takes the next props that are coming in and the next state and allows us to compare those values to see if for some reason we want a component to update or not. So we're going to go ahead, again, like the rest of them, console.log. We're going to log out the should component update as a string. And then we're going to go ahead and this will return a Boolean. And if it's true, then the component will update. If it's false, it will not. So let's go ahead and say we'll return true if the next state.current count divided by 2 or mod 2 is equal to 0. So basically we're saying we're only going to update it for the even numbers. So every 2 seconds it'll update visibly, but it's really updating the count every 1 second. Let's go ahead and add a component did update. And all we're going to do in this one is console.log component did update, so we can see that. And we'll add a component will unmount as well. So component will unmount console.log component will unmount. There we go. So that's going to be it for this one. Now let's go ahead and put this second counter into a container. And the container is going to control a little bit about how it counts. So whether the counting is being displayed or turned off. So let's create another app. We'll go ahead and call this one second counter container. Again, .js. Let's rename that one .js. And then here we'll go ahead and import React. And then let's import second counter from second counter. And let's create our class, our component. Export default class second counter container extends react dot component. Got our constructor. Now this one is not going to take any props, so we can call super, but we don't have to pass anything through there. We're going to say this dot state equals show counter, which will be a boolean, and it will be set to true. So we'll basically have a switch here to turn the counter on or off. So it's set to true by default. And then outside of this, let's go ahead and say render. This will return our counter. So let's put this inside of a div and say this.state.show counter. So if show counter is set to true, then we'll go ahead and show second counter, and we'll leave it like that, pass no props into it. If it's not true, don't show anything, be null. So we've got that. Let's go ahead and add a component did mount method. So when this is mounted, we're going to set an interval to start, and that interval is going to, after a certain amount of seconds, turn the show counter state property off. So we're going to say this.set state, and we're just going to pass in a show counter false. So it'll just turn it straight off. And put a semicolon there. And let's say we'll do this after, let's do it after 11 seconds. And it looks like I need a parenthesis there, take that from there. And there we go. We'll save that. And let's go back into our index.js right here. And let's import the second counter container from second counter container. And this is what we'll go ahead and put right here to render to our DOM. So let's go ahead and start this. npm start. Oops. npm start. And what should happen is we'll see the counter. It will be incrementing every 2 seconds. Let's inspect so we can see the console and see when everything's printed out as well. And then after 11 seconds, it should just stop displaying altogether. So there we go. Right, every 2 seconds it's incrementing. And we can see all the lifecycle methods that are being called, with the render being called every single time it does update. So we come back here to the beginning. There's the constructor was first, then the render. Once it was successfully rendered to the DOM, the component did mount was called, and then every time it does re-render, we get the should component update. So that's every time we call the set state, but it only does update every 2 times because it only updates on the even one. So should component update, then render again. Then component did update. Then should component update 2 times, again, since we're only going to set the state when, or we're only going to allow it to update and re-render when it's even, and then it renders. And then it did update. And then should it render? Yes, it renders after twice, update. And you can see the pattern here, how they're being called. And then we've got the should component update, and then we've got the component will unmount at the end because it turned it off. And now we have an error here because it can't perform an update on an unmounted component. So what we need to do here is we need to clear out those timers, those intervals that we set. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So let's go into our code here and go into our counter. Right, so this is the one that unmounted, but this interval still existed, and it tried to update something that was no longer mounted. So what we need to do is clear this interval. So we're going to assign this interval to a variable. So this dot, we'll call it timer. And then what we're going to do is in our component will unmount, that's a good place to clean up anything that's sitting around. We're going to go ahead and say clear interval this dot timer. So again, when a component is not rendered any further, so if we come back into here, this says if show counter is true, then render a second counter. If it's not, so otherwise, render null. So what happened is this component was there, the constructor ran, it rendered, and then it mounted. And then it went through its life cycle until no longer was show counter true, and so null was displayed instead. So in the DOM, React removed this component and replaced it with null. When it removed it, it unmounted. But this interval was still running in JavaScript, and it was trying to run on a component that was no longer mounted, so that threw an error. So what we need to do is in the component will unmount method, which you can see was called right here, right before anything happened, we're going to clear it. And since I've already saved it, now we can see it's working and there's actually no more error. So let's watch it. So it's at 2, render, update, should it update, render, update, should it update, yes, yes. We keep going until component will unmount, component's gone, it's not showing anymore, and we didn't get an error. So those are the lifecycle methods, and we can see how they are called throughout that lifecycle of a component.